The city that existed before history, and then vanished. The lost city of Hollow Creek. Long before the land was settled by men, before the rivers and hills had names, there was a city older than any man, older than the stories passed down by the oldest tribes. They called it Hollow Creek, a place whispered about around campfires, and spoken of in hushed tones whenever the moon hung heavy in the sky. It was said to be a city that existed before history, before the world knew what it was. Its streets were paved with stone that shone like silver, its towers high enough to touch the clouds, and its people, they say, were of a strange kind. Their eyes glowed with a knowledge that came not from books or wisdom, but from the earth itself. Some say Hollow Creek was a city of prosperity, a beacon of light, an example of what the world could be. Others, the ones who spoke with the weight of experience and trembled with fear, said Hollow Creek was a city of darkness that reached out like tendrils, dragging in those who ventured too close, wrapping them in shadows that never let go. But the one thing everyone agreed on was this: Hollow Creek vanished. One night, it was there, a gleaming city bathed in the light of 1,000 lanterns. The next morning it was gone. Vanished without a trace. And yet, if you know where to look, there are those who still speak of it. Those who say they have seen it just beyond the fog along the banks of the old creek. They speak in whispers, afraid to speak too loud lest the city, and whatever lives there, hear them. It was during the late spring of 1842 when a young man named William Garrett first heard the tales of Hollow Creek. He was a writer by trade, a man who made his living by collecting the stories of the people who lived in the hills of western Pennsylvania. But Hollow Creek wasn't like the other stories he had collected, stories of hauntings, old witches, and strange happenings in the woods. This was different. There was an urgency in the way the elders spoke of it, a fear that clung to their words, like a thick fog that wouldn't lift. William had grown up in the area, and though he'd heard the legends in passing, he had never truly believed in them. He dismissed them as the fabrications of old minds, senile and long past their prime. But as he grew older and his curiosity deepened, he began to wonder, could there really be a city lost to time? A place so ancient, so forgotten, that even the earth had swallowed it whole? He decided he would find it. He had no particular reason to think Hollow Creek was anything more than myth, but something about the old stories tugged at him. The descriptions of its shining streets, its grand buildings, its people with their strange, knowing eyes, they stuck with him. And so, with nothing but a knapsack filled with supplies and the resolve of a man determined to uncover the truth, he set out in search of the fabled city. He followed the creek as the legends suggested, letting the water guide him deeper into the untamed wilderness. The further he traveled, the stranger the land seemed to become. The trees grew taller, the air heavier, the sky darker. It was as though he was stepping into a different world entirely. And then, when the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, he found it. Hollow Creek. Or rather, what was left of it. It wasn't what William had imagined, no shining city of gleaming towers or streets paved with silver. What he found was something more eerie, more haunting. The ruins of the city stretched out before him, half buried in the earth, as though the land itself had tried to bury its dark secret. Stone pillars, half crumbled, stood like forgotten sentinels in the twilight. The creek, once a gentle stream, now ran through the ruins, its waters murky and dark, as if it too had been tainted by the past. William stepped cautiously into the ruins, his breath coming in short bursts as he looked around, trying to make sense of what lay before him. He could feel something in the air, an unease, a thick heaviness like the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant murmur of the creek. He moved deeper into the ruins, his eyes scanning the debris, his mind racing with questions. Where had the people gone? What had happened to this place? As he moved through the crumbling streets, he began to notice something odd. The buildings weren't destroyed by time or nature. No, these buildings had been abandoned, left to decay. And there, in the center of the city, was something that made William stop dead in his tracks. A statue. It stood in the center of what might have once been a grand square, a monument to something, or someone, that William couldn't quite understand. It was a figure of a man, tall and regal, but there was something wrong about it. The stone had worn away in places, and yet it still looked as though it were alive. The man in the statue seemed to be staring directly at him, his eyes hollow and dark. His hand was outstretched, as though beckoning William to come closer, to step into the shadows. Despite himself, William found his feet moving toward it. There was something about the statue, something that called to him, though he couldn't explain why. As he approached, the air grew colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold stone, and The ground shook. William staggered backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The statue, which had once been still, now seemed to be moving, its outstretched hand twitching. He felt an odd gnawing sensation in the pit of his stomach, like something was wrong, deeply wrong. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the shaking stopped. But something had changed. The world around him felt different. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if something ancient and terrible was watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. He could hear whispers again, low and soft, coming from the direction of the creek. The same voice, the same one he had heard earlier in the shadows of the city, now seemed to echo around him. Leave now or join them? William froze. His heart raced in his chest as the realization sank in. Hollow Creek wasn't just a city lost to time. It was something more, something alive, something cursed. He turned to leave, but his feet wouldn't move. The ground seemed to have rooted him in place, the whispers growing louder, the shadows closing in. He could feel them around him, them, the people who had vanished. And in the distance just beyond the creek he saw them. Figures. Shrouded in mist, their forms flickering in and out of view, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps. William's breath caught in his throat. He knew in that instant that Hollow Creek had never truly vanished. It had simply waited for someone foolish enough to seek it out. And now that someone was him. The city's secret. The figures moved closer, their forms still flickering like candle flames caught in the wind. William's heart thundered in his chest, each beat a reminder that he was standing at the edge of something far more ancient, and far more dangerous, than he could have ever imagined. His feet were rooted to the ground, his body unwilling to obey the frantic commands of his mind. It was as if the city, in all its broken grandeur, had taken hold of him, drawing him into its dark web. They came closer, their faces obscured by the mist that swirled around them like a cloak. The more William looked, the more their forms seemed to shift, to change, until it was unclear whether they were truly human or something else, something older than time itself. In a voice that was neither whisper nor shout, one of them spoke. You seek to uncover the forgotten, but beware, for some truths are meant to stay buried. The voice was soft, yet powerful, as if it came from 1,000 years of suffering and sorrow. William wanted to turn and run, to flee the city that had taken so many others before him. But his legs were frozen, his body unable to break free from the grip of Hollow Creek. The figures moved closer still, their eyes, those dark, endless pits, fixed upon him. The mist seemed to thicken with every passing moment, and the temperature dropped. His breath was visible, hanging in the air like fog. The figure who had spoken stepped forward, the mist parting around them like a veil. This figure was taller than the others, their silhouette now more defined. As they came into full view, William could see their face, a gaunt, weathered face like a mask of sorrow carved from stone. The eyes, though, were the most unsettling part. They weren't just dark, they were empty. Hollow eyes that stared through him as if they could see into his very soul. You are not the first to come here, the figure said, its voice like the cracking of old wood. Nor will you be the last. Hollow Creek is a city lost but not forgotten. A city that exists beyond time, beyond the reach of men. And it is a city that will claim you, just as it has claimed all who have come before you. William wanted to speak, to ask questions, to demand answers. But his throat tightened, the words stuck in his chest like stones. The figure seemed to read his mind, and with a slow, deliberate movement, it raised a hand toward the creek. Come look. Compelled by a force stronger than his own will, William moved forward, his body moving without his command, as if the city itself was guiding him toward the water. The mist parted before him, revealing the creek that wound its way through the city like a lifeblood, dark and sluggish, as if it carried the memories of those who had vanished. The figure stood beside him, its cold, empty eyes fixed on the water. Do you see it? The figure asked, its voice a low, reverberating echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. William stared into the creek, and at first, he saw nothing but the swirling darkness of the water. But then, something began to emerge, a shadow deep within the water. It was the faintest flicker at first, just a ripple, a movement in the current. And then it grew. The shape in the water became clearer, more defined. A figure that looked just like him. William recoiled, his heart racing as he stepped back from the edge of the creek. The figure in the water moved as he moved, mirroring his every action. He raised his hand, and the reflection in the creek raised its hand. He stepped back, and the figure in the water did the same. What is this? William finally managed to choke out. The figure beside him chuckled, the sound dry and rasping, like the wind through dead leaves. It is the truth, the city's secret. William turned to the figure, confusion and fear spreading through him. A reflection of me? What do you mean? The figure's hollow eyes softened, but only for a moment. Hollow Creek does not just take the body, William. It takes the soul, the essence of who you are. All who come to this city find themselves reflected in the creek. And all who remain, all who stay, become a part of it. The city grows, fed by their presence, by their essence. You too will join the others. William's stomach turned, the sickening realization dawning on him. The people he had seen, the figures in the mist, the faces that had flickered in and out of existence. They were him, or rather, they had once been. Hollow Creek didn't just claim the living. It claimed their souls and trapped them in an eternal reflection, feeding off their essence until there was nothing left but a shadow of who they had been. But as the figure spoke, something inside William began to stir. The mist around them seemed to thicken, swirling faster and faster. He could feel the air pressing in on him, the whispers growing louder, almost deafening. The figure's words echoed in his mind, their meaning crystal clear. It is too late for you now, William. The city has already taken root within you. There is no escaping Hollow Creek. No escaping what it demands. William's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to face the figure fully. The reflection in the creek still moved, still mimicked his every move. But this time he saw something different. The figure in the water wasn't just mimicking him anymore, it was starting to move on its own. Its eyes glowed in the murky depths of the creek, a sickly light, and its mouth twisted into a grin that was not his. No? William shouted, backing away from the water, his mind racing. I won't be a part of this. I won't. The ground beneath him trembled, the city itself groaning in response to his defiance. The sky above seemed to crack, the dark clouds swirling ominously. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The air grew still once more, and for a moment William thought, maybe, he had escaped. But the figure beside him reached out, its hand cold and unyielding, and placed it on his shoulder. There is no escaping Hollow Creek. And in that moment, William felt it, the coldness seep into his bones, the creeping darkness wrapping around his heart, tightening its grip. The city had him now. He was no longer a visitor. He was part of Hollow Creek. And he would never leave. The endless reflection. William awoke with a jolt. His breath was sharp, his chest heaving as if he had been submerged in ice water. His mind was clouded, the dream, or whatever it had been, still lingering at the edges of his thoughts. He felt disoriented, but his surroundings were eerily familiar. The crumbling ruins of Hollow Creek stretched before him, the dark creek winding through the heart of the city, its murky waters whispering against the stones. But there was something different now. The weight of the necklace around his neck, the invisible burden, felt heavier, more suffocating than before. He tried to stand, but his legs felt unsteady as if they were no longer his own. The city was silent, the oppressive silence hanging in the air like a thick fog. He stumbled through the ruins, his feet dragging behind him as the shadows seemed to reach for him from every direction. The cold was unbearable, gnawing at his bones, and as he passed by what remained of a broken tower, he caught sight of his reflection. He froze. The water of the creek mirrored him, but his reflection was wrong. The man in the water was no longer just a mirror image. The figure had shifted. The eyes in the reflection were the same dark, hollow pits he had seen in the figure beside him. The mouth of the reflection curled into a smile that did not belong to him. It was as though the city was trying to swallow him whole, pulling his very essence into the depths of the creek. William gasped, stumbling back, but his reflection, did not move. It stood there, in the murky water, staring at him with a gaze that could pierce through time and space, through every fiber of his being. You cannot escape. The words seemed to come from everywhere. The air vibrated with the force of them, a voice that belonged to the city itself. William's pulse raced as he backed away from the creek. The ground under his feet seemed to quiver, and the ruins around him seemed to come alive, the stones groaning like they were stretching after a long slumber. This is your fate, William. He spun around, but there was no figure this time, just the empty air, thick with the weight of his own fear. His thoughts were a whirlwind, confusion clouding his judgment. Was he dreaming? Was this another trap, another reflection of the city's dark power? The city had already taken root within him, it seemed, but something in the deepest corner of his mind refused to accept it. He had come here seeking answers, but now the questions were endless, swirling like the fog around him. He couldn't accept this. He couldn't let Hollow Creek claim him like it had claimed so many before. The whispering grew louder. The city itself was calling to him, beckoning him to stay, to become one with its shadows. He could hear the voices of those who had come before him, their cries of agony echoing through the ruins. And then, from the darkness came the figure again, the one with the hollow eyes standing just beyond the creek. It was taller now, more menacing, its form blurring in and out of focus. The shadows clung to it like a cloak, its silhouette both terrifying and familiar. "You cannot escape what you've awoken, William." The voice was chilling, filled with an ancient sorrow. "You are one with the city now. You belong to Hollow Creek." William's chest tightened. He turned toward the creek, desperate for some way out, but the water was thick with shadows now, a swirling, inky darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The city wasn't just haunted, it was alive. Alive with the souls of those who had vanished, alive with the memories of a past so old, it had long since faded into legend. As William stood there, staring into the abyss of the creek, he felt the pull again, the same pull he had felt from the moment he had first set foot in the ruins. The city was calling to him, not just to trap him but to consume him. And then, in the silence that followed, it happened. The reflection in the water twisted. The figure in the creek no longer mimicked his movements. It stepped forward, its hand reaching out from the water, beckoning him. The face in the water smiled, a twisted, malicious grin that did not belong to him. "Come to me, William." The voice was now a low, rumbling growl. "You are part of us now." His heart pounded in his chest as the figure reached further, its hand now breaking the surface of the water. The mist that clung to the ruins swirled, thickening as if the city itself was closing in on him, trapping him in its web. "No!" William screamed, the desperation in his voice cutting through the eerie calm of the ruins. "I will not be part of you." But his words were lost to the wind, lost to the shadow of the city. The reflection in the creek laughed, a sound that echoed in his ears, bouncing off the stone walls of the ancient city. It was too late. The city had him. Hollow Creek had him. The water surged forward, the shadows leaping from the creek and enveloping him, dragging him down into the cold, dark depths. The reflection in the water smiled one last time, its hollow eyes glowing with a sickly light. And then there was nothing. The ruins of Hollow Creek stood still, quiet once more as the mist settled around them. The creek, dark and quiet, rippled gently under the pale moonlight. And in the distance, just beyond the fog, you could still hear the whispers of those who had come before. The lost souls of Hollow Creek, still waiting for the next curious wanderer to fall into their trap, to be claimed by the city that existed before history, and would exist long after it.